And just shout out in a couple, 3 words, what, or a short phrase, what was it that made that class super motivating or super unmotivating to you?
Teacher's passion.
Passion?
The challenge.
Okay, and the challenge was just right, not too much?
Exactly. Yeah, just the right amount.
Topic. I would say topic.
And what was the topic? It was just kind of interesting. It was useful. It was
For me, if I can see potential, the topic can help me find a good job position. So I'm more interested.
okay.
Unclear expectations.
Unclear expectations. Ooh, a classic. Anything else?
Fear of failure was motivating.
Okay, so the failure had consequences. I remember my undergrad, and it's been said, amongst people who plan curriculum and so forth, that basically what you plan reflects what you took or suffered as an undergraduate. And I was a Husky, so don't hold that against me. 25 years at WSU, was 5 years at UW. And I had 2 classes, just real fast. One was super motivating and one was super unmotivating. And the super motivating one, of all things, was a statistics class. And part of what made it motivating was that I knew I was going to have to use it as a psych major. The work was challenging, but not too challenging. It was carved up so that every 2 weeks we had to turn in homework, and then the other set of 2 weeks, every 2 weeks we had exams. So it was constantly on top of us. It was very clear that studying paid off in terms of higher grades. Were a few things about the class. And then the instructor was obviously very clear and made a difficult concept easier. The most unmotivating class I had as an undergraduate was a physics class, which is kind of surprising because I love physics. And it actually turned me off of the natural sciences and engineering and turned me into psych. And part of the problem with that class was that it was all equations. I didn't understand why all the equations were important. I understand now that eventually I was going to have to know these things. It just didn't seem like a fun place to start. All the stuff that was kind of fun in terms of what the various laws of physics meant and so forth, there was none of that. It was just grinding equation after equation, monotony for 10 weeks. And I gave up. And it's the only class in my undergraduate career where about halfway, 2/3 mark, I just stopped studying completely. Funny thing about that, though, was I remember showing up for the final exam because I'm just kind of obsessive compulsive that way. And as I was showing up to class, sitting there, having no idea what the prof was talking about. And I remember going through the exam, and it was almost kind of freeing. It's like, I have no idea what that is. Oh, I think I might can answer that question. I was the first one to leave the exam. As a glutton for punishment, I actually went back after the grades were posted to see how awful my grade was. I got a B+, which actually really angered me. And the reason it angered me was I'm looking at this and saying, okay, well, it didn't harm my GPA, but, I was averaging 30% on the exams, and it's like, and I felt like I knew almost nothing. I felt like I'd given up, and yet I was doing better than average? How can that be? And so that kind of affected me. Anyway, I want to talk about using a couple different theories to figure out how we can motivate students better in our own courses right now. And as you well know, it can be a challenging task. The students don't study as much as we think that they should. The most recent stats we compiled, at least I think it was just in the Carson College of Business, was they spend about 30 hours per week, full-time students, on their going to class and studying, and that was it. It used to be worse. I remember one time Chuck and I were in a meeting early on in the days at the Teaching Academy, and we were looking at the NESE data when the first time we did NESE, and it came back that the students were studying 11 hours per week. outside of class. And Chuck and everyone else, we all kind of looked at each other and we're like, nah, that can't be right. That's way too high. He said, no. That's total, not per course. We looked at each other, nah, that's way too low. And the student government was in on that meeting, and they all said, no, that's right. Part of the problem that we face, that our students face, is, we're in competition for their attention. They've got so many different activities going on, many extracurricular, many co-curricular, and many worthwhile co-curricular activities, not worthwhile, obviously. And if they're a full-time student, 4 other courses besides the one you're teaching. How do you win that contest for their attention? I think it's a reasonable question to ask, maybe a bit competitive, but it's a reasonable question to ask how it is that you're going to win that particular competition. It won't happen simply if you're super clear at the podium. That's probably a necessary condition, but by no means sufficient. So it's not just, that you have to get up there and you do your part and you do your job and they get it or they don't get it, they try or they don't try. I am arguing that wouldn't be a very successful way to motivate students. I personally believe that it's my job as an instructor to motivate my students. But maybe a somewhat controversial statement. I've met other faculty who disagree with that statement. But I don't want to leave it up to them. Part of the reason is that how well a student does and what that student retains at graduation doesn't just affect that student. It affects all the other WSU students. Pardon me for using a little bit of business speak here, but it's our brand. It's our brand image. When employers come and hire and you got a student who didn't learn much and didn't retain much and say, well, hey, I've met WSU graduates before. Why would I want another? Right? That's not acceptable to me. And so it is, I think, our business to make sure that students learn sufficient amount of skills and knowledge, whether they want to or not. You may not agree with that perspective or not. It motivates me to try and think about these things and try to get students to work harder in the classes. So I just kind of want to put that out there before I get into these particular theories. Now, one of the frustrations I hear from many faculty is like, well, students today, they don't want to study, they're here to party, whatever sort of excuses, they have no interest in coming to class, et cetera, et cetera. And we see these behaviors all the time. Faculty, and we're not making this up, this happens, right? But to look at that behavior and then try and come up with an explanation for that behavior and say, well, it's the students. The problem is the students, is an example of what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, which is that we as humans have the tendency, when we look for explanations, particularly for undesirable behaviors, to say it's the person, it's who that person is, it's their personality, it's their intent, it's their work ethic, it's something internal to them. So we're biased to come up with explanations and come up with these internal explanations about them, as opposed to external explanations say, well, it's not necessarily who they are, it's the environment in which they find themselves. Managers do this all the time too. Why are my employees so unproductive? Because they're lazy. We actually have a term for that measure. We call it the lazy attribution error. Some of them may not have a very good work ethic, but if all of them seem to be that way, a more likely explanation is that it's the environment. Now, this is a good news, bad news kind of thing, if you can counteract this fundamental attribution error. It kind of feels like bad news, because what I'm suggesting here is the blame's not so much on the students, it's on us, the faculty. And who likes to blame themselves? And that's kind of bad news, right? But the reason that's good news, actually, to the extent that it's true, we're talking about bias, and there's no guarantees here. But the reason it's good news is because you can't change adults' personalities. You can change how you teach. If it really were all about the students, then we're stuck. What are we going to do? Okay? If it's not all about the students, it's only a little bit about the students, and it's a lot about us and how we design our courses and implement them, then that's something we can change and perhaps change the situation. Now, my perception of sort of how much is environment versus kind of how much is the students, these numbers are a little bit pulled out of thin air, but I don't know, they sound kind of right, which is, when I think of it, a distribution, say 100 students in a class, I think there's 10 to 20 students who are what I call untouchables. There's something going on in their lives. It's such a powerful distraction. It can be a health issue. It can be a family issue. It can be a college adjustment issue. Whatever it may be, there's very little you can do to touch them or reach them. At the other end of the distribution, say another 10 to 20 students, who I call, they're teacher-proof. Doesn't matter how bad the class is, they're going to work hard and figure it out. In part because maybe they're concerned about protecting their grade. There may be other motivations in there as well, and they certainly have the ability. But they're going to succeed no matter what's thrown at them. In between the untouchables and the teacher-proof, it's the giant middle, say 60 to 80% of the students, who are touchable, who, in my experience, will react positively or negatively to how you design your course in terms of trying to motivate them. In other words, the vast bulk of your class can be motivated, or they can be unmotivated. Much as some examples some of you were thinking of in your undergraduate experience in classes that you found unmotivating, right? You wouldn't say that, well, hey, I was just some people might say it, but most people would say I was a lazy student. They'd say, it's a terrible class. So that's kind of the premise. Before I dive down into a couple theories of motivation, any quick comments or questions or maybe disagreements with any of this, with my premise? Yes, in the back, in the red jacket.
Thing with regard to undergraduate students at WSU, and that is that there is the WSU environment that one class is a very small component of. And there is a certain cultural differentiation of the students, because some of them, when they go to study, well, that's not what their friends are doing, okay? Their friends are out doing other things. So there is a dynamic within WSU that, in some places at least, discounts the idea of working hard in a course and getting something back out of it. And from the standpoint of an individual course, we have relatively little we can do about it. We might be able to do something in terms of the global picture of how WSU students relate to faculty, but within an individual course, we can't touch a lot of what their environment is. And their environment is a lot more than the 3 hours a week they might spend in our course.
Yeah, you're right, and that's the challenge. And I have seen that culture amongst the undergraduate students. Where I might maybe disagree with you a little bit is that there's only so much you can do when you have them 3 hours a week. I think if what you're doing is well designed and very different, and as we'll get into these theories, and you are influencing things that they truly care about, then most of them, not all of them, but even in sort of the Pullman undergraduate culture, most of them will respond. That's that's part of the premise, and I think as I get a little detail in these theories, maybe I'll give you some ideas about what you can do. The other part of the challenge about that, though, is you can come and say, well, my course is going to be different than the other courses you may have taken so far that you managed to ignore because you're distracted by this other sort of environment. And they might, everybody says that. They're not sort of taking your course tabula rasa. They're sort of like, I think I've seen this before. And it may take them a little while to get it before they realize, oh, wait a minute, this is different. So one of the things I actually do is a technique, the very first day of class, is I make it very clear in which ways my courses are very different than what they've had, and if they average it and think of it as the same, how they're going to quickly find themselves in trouble. And I follow through on it. But I understand that frustration, and I understand that culture. And one of the things now is, as Associate Dean for the Carson College of Business, and I've been touring many classrooms in Pullman, and and seeing that. A lot of students skipping classes, I think, for very many of the reasons you reach. I've also seen the opposite. I will embarrass him. I'll embarrass Chuck here. I visited his class, and I didn't see that. I saw students working hard, and I saw full attendance, even in very large classrooms. So Chuck, for example, has somehow, I think, in that environment, figured out how to counteract that a little bit. But yeah, it's a challenge. Any other quick questions or comments? All right, well, let me move on to specific suggestions. As you've probably already leafed through your slides, I've got two theories I want to share with you. One is called expectancy theory, is a theory of extrinsic motivation. The other, it's called the job characteristics model, is a theory of intrinsic motivation. And these theories come out of management, and they're very well tested and have survived the test in the workplace. And so what I'm suggesting to do here is to apply them into the classroom, although the application in the classroom, there's much less data on that. So I'm speaking a little bit from my experience of applying these theories to course design. But what I'm suggesting here, and the reason I'm giving you two theories, is there's extrinsic motivation. So, they'll be motivated to do it because you're giving them some sort of reward that they value, or they're trying to avoid some punishment that they fear, like Chuck was talking about fear of failure. But ideally, we don't want students to be merely extrinsically motivated. I think most teachers' fantasies that the students are intrinsically motivated. They're just into it. They like your class. They like the topic. It's fun. And so the question becomes is how do you make it fun, interesting, or useful to them in a way that they see, so they just sort of naturally want to work hard anyway. And I think it's possible to do both at the same time. So let's start with expectancy theory. So you've got a slide there that's got 6 boxes, and let me sort of talk you through that slide. So the idea of expectancy theory, it's just a theory of, I'll start it with it in the workplace context from which it comes, and then we'll apply it to the classroom context. In the workplace context, it's a theory about employees' expectations. What do they expect will happen if they do certain things or don't do certain things? And so you look at this diagram, and it basically, at the left side, upper left there, it's, person exerts work effort. They're motivated. They work hard. And then the arrow says to achieve, they're working hard for a reason, because they expect that they will achieve performance standards, that whatever tasks or performance standards are laid out for them, that if they work hard, they believe, they expect, they can achieve them. And this particular link, if you look at the box underneath that arrow, is called expectancy, which is confusing. It's the same name as the theory. It's a badly named theory, but it is what it is. And if it confuses you, think of, albums where the first track is the same name as the whole album. Anyway. And there's a set of questions that they might ask around that, such as, can I achieve the desired level of task performance? If my boss tells me I have to sell so much by this particular date, do I believe I can actually pull it off? So that's the type of question they might ask themselves. And, related questions might be, am I capable? Do I have the skills? Do I have the time? Have they given me the resources? Right? Think about our own experiences at WSU when, the dean's office or the provost's office asks us to do something, and your first question is, yeah, but if we're not going to give us any more resources, how are we going to do that? That's an expectancy question. Not in the dean's office, though. I see that from the other side. Joke. Anyway. So moving on to the right, explaining this diagram here, is even if they believe that they're capable and they can achieve the task performance, they want to know, and the question here is, do they expect that hitting these performance targets will actually lead to outcomes? Is there any consequence for it? So if I hit my sales targets, is there any consequence for doing so? If I miss my sales targets, is there any consequence for that? So one of the questions that we all ask, and we've asked it since we were small children, is, are there any consequences? That's the so-called, the box underneath that arrow, the instrumentality question. It's called instrumentality because the question is my performance instrumental to achieving certain outcomes? So if I do as you ask, what happens next? What do I get? Seems like a very selfish question, but here we're talking about extrinsic motivation. And then the last box there on the right, which is basically, okay, so there are outcomes or there are consequences. Yeah, but do I care about them? Is it a big consequence or is it a trivial consequence? Is it a really big raise or is it a 1% raise? Is it a really harsh punishment or is it a slap on the wrist? These kind of questions that people may ask. And sometimes, in dysfunctional work environments, when they ask these questions about what they should expect, they come up with really bad answers. I mean, by bad answers, I don't mean incorrect. I mean, just, gosh, that's sad to see that. For example, if we're talking about the expectancy portion, so that first link there on the left, they might say, well, my boss won't tell me what, she really wants. The expectations are so unclear. How can I possibly hit any performance target if I don't even know what they are? That was an example from an unmotivating class. It was unclear what the instructor wanted. Same thing in the workplace, right? It's impossible to complete the task in time if they're not allowing extensions. One that you hear. Some people say, I'm no good at this. I wasn't trained. That could be a confidence issue. Another one is, well, I can control how hard I work, but I can't control what my teammates do. And so far, is my work any good? Have I gotten any feedback that I'm even on the right track? So if those are the answers to these questions, then that sense of expectancy is going to be much lower. That link's going to be much weaker. Similarly, the second one, instrumentality, and some bad answers that workers might come up with are, well, hey, nobody reviews my good work, so nobody knows that I'm even hitting the performance targets. So there's not going to be any consequence for hitting those performance targets. Another very common one. It's really political here. People don't get what they deserve. People don't get rewards, promotions, raises, etc., opportunities because they did as they are asked. It's because who they know, or something kind of unfair like that. Another classic one. They say they want performance, for example, teamwork, but they measure for something else. Individual sales work figures. Or to take a rather painful example we've all experienced, they say they want us to do a good job teaching. What do they reward for, we think?
Research.
It's a little overstated, but I'm sure you've heard, if not at some point in your career, felt the sentiment. So that tends to lead to a weak instrumentality. So that's the theory. One other thing about this theory that I think is the theory's got right, and it's really useful, is that you can think of these links as like a chain. It's an overused cliche, but it's like a chain, and if any of the links is broken, it doesn't matter how strong the other links are. You got to have some of each. If any of these things is zero, the whole thing's zero. Motivation is zero. So, for example, I might believe as a worker that I'm capable of doing the job and I have the time and the resources, so my expectancy is fine. And I may believe that this is an apolitical, fair workplace that knows how well I work, so my instrumentality is fine. But then if I find out that there are no raises, no promotions, there's no anything, and nobody even punishes around here, nobody can get fired, then the consequences are too trivial. I'm not motivated, even though the first two links were really strong. Or another example would be, let's say that there are really good consequences. People do get fired. People can get nice promotions and raises. And let's say I believe I am capable of doing my job well, but I think it's so political that and that performance measurement is done so informally and so sparingly that no one's going to notice if I do good work. So how much more motivated am I going to be if they double the raise, if I believe it's something that's unachievable in the first place? It's not motivating. And the kind of cool thing I think about expectancy theory, and so it's one of my favorite motivation theories, and I teach it in my leadership class, is it suggests that if motivation is low, if motivation is broken, you got to fix the part that broke, not the part that ain't broke. So when I see, books like 1,001 Ways to Motivate Employees or Rewards for Employees, I think, well, that's a great book if your problem at work is a valence problem. If your problem is an expectancy problem, the book does you absolutely no good. So that's a theory. That's where it comes from. That's what we're talking about here. Now, applying it in the classroom. So I've laid out some of these things. So if we start, look at the slide that says students' expectancy questions. Student's going to ask him or herself, if I try, if I work hard at this class, will I succeed? That is, will I hit the performance targets that the instructor has established? And so when you're thinking about how you design your class is, what is it about the way you design your class that would help that student answer that either, oh, absolutely, I believe that. If I try, I will succeed. I can expect that. Or conversely, you might cause them to believe, yeah, it doesn't matter how hard I try, I can't succeed. So some common ones. Is it clear what the professor is asking for? And that's a tricky one because part of the problem with communication is it's clear to you. You wrote it. You know what you want. It may not be clear to them. And that's sort of a longer conversation about why authors are often very overconfident about how clearly they're coming across when it's a one-way conversation and there's not a dialogue. Is it realistic? Do they have enough time to do it? If they believe it's unrealistic, and there's a whole literature on goal setting, unrealistic goals are unmotivating. They'll stop. They won't try. What's the point? I'm never going to hit the target. Of course, there's a question about whether they have the skills. One of the things that helps them believe that they have the skills is if they're getting feedback as they go along. Am I getting it right? Am I on the right track with what the instructor is asking for? So one of the ways that you can increase that is to give more frequent feedback. So, for example, rather than have just, say, 2 exams, a midterm and a final, is you might break it up and have, a number of mini exams or quizzes or something like that, where they can kind of see, okay, I understand the types of questions, I understand where the instructor is going. Or if you use multiple papers, you get paper back with adequate feedback that says, okay, this part was really good, this part isn't working so good, you need to work on this for your next similar paper. But they need to get that paper back with feedback before the next paper is due, so they can iterate. And I know that sounds really obvious when I say it, but I've seen a lot of classes where that's not happening. Another big one, group projects. There are a number of students who feel that they can work hard, but they can't control what their group mates do. And if their group is starting to fall apart, you will see a lot of students give up. Now, there might be one student who's so paranoid about their grade plummeting that they'll become a dictator and take over the whole thing. That often happens, right? That's not what we want to see, right? We want to see everybody contributing to the group. It's a whole nother conversation for later time about how you set up group projects so that that doesn't happen. All right. Instrumentality questions that students might have. I've got a whole bunch of those if you go to that page of the handout. And I sort of categorize them under sort of two mirror sides of a question. First one is, if I succeed, will I be rewarded? For example, and in the classroom, we're pretty much talking about rewarded with higher grades, for the most part. And if I fail or misbehave, am I actually going to be punished? Why would they believe that, or why would they not believe that? Well, it kind of depends on how you run your course. So, for example, if I score a good on the rubrics, is my grade going to be higher? Well, not if I think this is the type of instructor who gives everybody A's, or conversely, some who just give everybody C's. If they believe that, and sometimes they'll believe that when it's not exactly quite true, then there's no instrumentality. It doesn't matter how hard they work; they're going to get the same grade. So why work harder? If I speak up in class or even go to class, is my grade going to be higher? So is there a connection between attendance and talking in class, more for smaller classes, but even in larger classes, attendance? Does that affect their grade? If I attend class, will the lecture material be on the exam? I know, I hate that question as much as the rest of you. I mean, it's important to them, right? I mean, let me step back for a second. I didn't care about these things. I wish all my students were intrinsically motivated, and we could just have, a great time talking about the ideas and working through the skills. But you know what? That wasn't the hand I was dealt. I got to play the hand I was dealt. Right? And they're all in that situation. Got to play the hand that we were dealt. If I read the text, will it be on the exam? If I don't read the text, will I not be able to follow the lecture? If I put in extra effort to write well an assignment, will the professor even notice it, even grade it, even give any feedback on it? And sort of a catch-all question I've got here, is there even any added value for going to class? One of the things, in the Teaching Academy, we've done these sessions for PhD students, and I've gotten this question a number of times. I'll share with you. So a student will come up to me and say, hey, it's a problem in my class. I'm like, yeah, okay, so what's going on? And the student will say, well, half my students don't show up to class. I'm like, uh-huh. And can I ask you a few more questions? Like, yeah, sure. I said, so the half who don't show up to class, how are they doing on the graded work? Oh, they're doing fine. Well, more precisely, how are they doing compared to the students who do show up? About the same. Okay. Well, there's a problem. And then I would ask them, so tell me a little bit more about what you do during class. And we'll go over the textbook. Well, I mean, something you need them more. I mean, are you repeating? And I have a more diplomatic way to ask this, but the short version: are you repeating what's in the textbook, or are you doing something different and complementary? Yeah, I'm repeating what's in the textbook. Now we know. The students have figured out that they can either go to class and not do the readings, which I forgot to say that part, because those who show up to class don't do the readings. They can go to class and not do the readings, or they can do the readings and not go to class, but there's no reason to do both. They're redundant, and they're busy. So they don't. I'm kind of annoyed, actually, when I hear things like that, because I wasn't that kind of student. I did whatever I was told. I think most of you were like that. Of course, we're odd. We're the ones who never left college, right? We loved it so much. And sometimes we wish that they were more like whoever we were, and that's not who they are. But I'm a little bit annoyed by that, but at the same time, I get it. It's rational. Some other sort of, bad answers I've seen from people who've had, motivation problems I would classify as an instrumentality issue, is that the prof doesn't really read the paper very closely. Why do they believe that? Because there's almost no marks on the paper. The prof only calls on his or her favorite students. So there's no point in raising my hand. One of my favorites is the prof throws a question out to the class and nobody answers it. And often what's going on there is that the students have figured out that if nobody answers a question, the professor will answer his or her own question, often very quickly. Because the professor's more uncomfortable with silence than the students are. There's another thing about instrumentalia, a saying that it comes out of accounting, actually. And it's that which gets measured gets done. That which gets measured gets done. In the workplace, and I think in the classroom as well, that there's lots of things that we're asked to do. We're all, everybody's really busy doing all kinds of stuff. And when you can't do everything, what do you drop? You tend to drop, all other things being equal, that which isn't measured. Because there's no consequences for it, because nobody knows how much of it you're doing, because they're not measuring it. That's what gets dropped. So I'm a big believer that if you want a certain student behavior, you got to measure for it. And it's got to be very visible to them that you're measuring for it, and then connect it to grades. So my classes are all small, not greater than 45 students. And so, we have a lot of conversation, and I need my students to talk, or my whole teaching style doesn't work. And so I reward for participation. It's 10% of their grade. They got to speak in class. I know some of them are uncomfortable doing it. And I know some of them never will. And I know some of them you have a hard time shutting up. But there's that 60 to 80% in the middle who will rarely speak up in class, who otherwise will speak up, significantly more frequently because they know their grade's riding on it. So, course design issues based on this. Make sure there's variance in the grades that you give out. Don't give all A's or all B's or all of the same of anything. There's got to be variance. And students have to believe that there's variance. One of the ways, by the way, I make students believe it, I'm preparing for my first class tomorrow, and I show them this. Can you read that? Is that visible?
Yes.
Every grade I've given over the last 15 years. Nothing grabs your attention on the first day like this graph. Nothing I do anyway. Okay? And one of my points of doing that, there's a couple points, but the point that's relevant to what we're talking about is that there's variation. They can get A's, they can get C's, they can get D's. It's up to them. All right, what else do I want to say about that? See how we're doing on time here. So, before I go into the theory of intrinsic motivation, any sort of questions or comments about applying expectancy theory? All right. Take a look at the slide that says the job characteristics model. This again comes out of the workplace. It's the theory of intrinsic motivation. It tends to be for many employees, not all employees, if you give them a job description, what features should it have for them to be intrinsically motivated to do it? In short, what makes the job so fun, so interesting, so personally rewarding that I can't believe they pay me to do it, I'd do it for free. And so to get the particular outcomes, if you look at the right column, you want them to be motivated, you want them to be satisfied with their work, you want them to be effective at work, same things we want in our classroom. For them to be motivated, satisfied, effective, there's this mediating variable called the critical psychological state. And there's 3 parts to it. They have to basically believe that their work is meaningful, that they have a sense of responsibility, that it's their work, and they have to know how well they're doing. So they need knowledge of results. And so moving left then, that left column, the core job characteristics, these are the specific features of a job, the characteristics of a job, that tend to produce these psychological states which lead to these outcomes. So if they want work to be meaningful, it's going to be more meaningful to the extent that it uses a greater variety of skills. And it's probably going to be more interesting, and it's going to be less monotonous, and some other benefits that also help with satisfaction. Applying this to the classroom as we go here, one of the problems with the giant lecture halls, I think, is captured by this theory. And in the giant lecture halls, there's very little skill variety. It's fairly passive. You sit there, you take notes, and then you study for multiple choice exams. Right? When you got hundreds of students, it's just the sheer scale of the thing. Often we feel that's all we can do. But the problem with that is it's not very interesting to the students, and it's less meaningful to the students. Because they're not practicing a variety of skills they're going to use. Rarely in life, again, will they take multiple choice exams, except to get their driver's license and maybe pass, some professional exams. They would rather sort of wrestle and work with the subject and talk about the subject than just sit there and listen about it, although, better lecturers can help in this regard, but still, it's just low in skill variety. I'm going to skip down to task significance. This one's fairly straightforward. Task identity is a little bit cryptic. How significant is the task? So when it comes to the classroom, whatever it is that you're having them doing, or whatever the subject matter is it significant to them? Is it something, for example, they believe they're going to use later? That one's big. Or they believe it's something they'll never use again? I'm always worried about that one. In my class, every time I switch to a different topic, I'm always selling the topic. Here's why you need this topic. And if you don't learn this, here's all these awful things that are going to happen to you in the workplace. I like horror stories. Another thing that make the task significant is to say if they're writing a paper. If they're writing the paper about, it's a little bit easier to do in, say, a class on leadership in business school. But one of the things is, have them, instead of writing about some company they've never heard of before, never interacted with, and never will, I can have them write about an experience that they've had at work or are having at work, and how might they solve it. It tends to be a lot more meaningful. Task identity refers to how much you identify with a task. Is it basically being yours, where you can look and say, hey, I did that. Group projects undermine that, by the way. Autonomy, it's fairly straightforward. Are they working on it by themselves? Do they have any discretion? Do they get to make any choices? Are they simply doing exactly as they're told? Or, again, for another problem, difficulty with group projects is they don't feel autonomous because the rest, it's not, that wasn't my work. So-and-so in the group did that part. And then finally, what kind of feedback are they getting? Do they know? Do they have any objective feedback about whether they are grasping whatever it is that you're teaching? It says if they don't get any feedback along the way that they're not grasping it, then why would they know that they're not grasping it? If they don't know that they're not grasping it, why would they work harder to grasp it? So you need to get the feedback from the task. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, part of what you want to do is to allow them to iterate across multiple quizzes, exams, papers, assignments, whatever it might be, and then give them the feedback along the way. So those are, I think, some of the design features that tend to lead to a more intrinsically rewarding experience for the students. Again, I don't quite have the data to prove that in the classroom situation. Maybe it's a study I'll get to one of these days. But this model has received quite a bit of support in the workplace context. So let me, coming up on 12:57 here, let me just sort of stop here and see what specific questions you may have about any of this or anything else related to motivation that maybe you're hoping we could talk about.
What are some considerations for designing effective group work?
that keeps the students?
First consideration should be is it should really require a group. If it's possible for a smart individual working hard to do it alone, then you will very often have a smart individual working hard alone, annoying the rest of the group. Often we give group projects not so much to, and I'm guilty of doing this early in my career, I'm going to talk about myself, but I know others who have, I did it because I just didn't want to grade that many papers. So if I had 5-person groups, that's 1/5 of the papers to grade, or 1/5 of the projects to grade. That's a lot. Obviously, that's a lousy reason, popular reason, but it's a lousy reason. And so what should be better is that there's something about the size of the task that's impossible for one person to do alone. Or maybe you're teaching a course on teamwork, and so that they got to be in teams to learn that. Something along those lines I think is the first rule. A second rule is that there should be designated leadership roles in teams. Often people just think of one role, and that one role is the person who sets the meetings and maybe has an agenda. Well, you need to do that, and there's a little bit more to agenda setting than that. You also need to have somebody who facilitates all the group dynamics. Somebody who's sort of the natural diplomat of the group, who pays attention to, well, who's contributing, who's not contributing, who's struggling, who isn't struggling, who's speaking a lot, who have we not heard from. Kind of the things that we as teachers do in the classroom, actually. That kind of facilitation is another big one. There needs to be devil's advocacy, either built into the process or given as a leadership role, is another major one. Group contracts are really helpful. So they start out with a contract. So for example, what happens if somebody skips a meeting? What's their obligation? And then of course those contracts have to be enforced, or they're just a piece of paper. So those are a few things that seem to help a lot with group projects. The other big thing, of course, which you may have heard before, is don't let them form their own groups. You need to, and not by neighbor, not by alphabet. It should be done by skills. So there's certain, often you would put people in groups because the reason that no one person can do it well is because it requires a greater variety of skills than one person has. So what you need to do is make sure that there are different skill sets. And I would measure for those skill sets, not by demographic diversity, but by functional diversity. So knowing a little bit something about the students, about what students are good at or what they're not good at. There's a program called CATME that helps you do that. You can run a draft system. There's different ways to do that. So those are the first that come to mind. It's a good question. Other questions? Comments? Disagreements?
I'm working with finding a balance between autonomy and enough specific direction. And having just done my annual review, I'm feeling like this is really fresh in my mind from last semester, right? So. Okay. I teach a class where the students have an awful lot of autonomy to generate their own project and develop it. And so therefore, the directions I give, I feel are kind of clear for the process, but they aren't specific to what each of them is doing. And that amount of freedom is frustrating to them. And so my next challenge now for this next semester is how do I help them build up to feeling confident that they have the knowledge and skills to do what they need to do, even if the directions aren't specific to, put a period here. It needs to be open enough for everybody's project and narrow enough to give them all some general direction.
So this is an ongoing project where you're doing this?
Yeah, each semester it's an ongoing project, yes.
So, yeah, and it's difficult to think of specifying possibly everything, even if you could do it. You wouldn't want to overspecify, right? So I think you're right to look for a balance. Part of what I've seen a lot of people do successfully with semester-long projects like that is, they'll start out with sort of the basic boundaries, and then they have lots of different check-in points and lots of different deliverables along the way. So you might say, okay, first, it's going to be the outline, then it's going to be this section, and then you're going to, go out and do this bit of research, and then you're going to come back and this is what's found, and then you have this draft, and the professor will then check in, at 3, 4, 5 points. And so what happens is if they start to go, you think, well, that's not what I meant. They're kind of going off this way. You can kind of, before they get too far going off this way, you can kind of, no, you need to come back this way. And again, I think it's part of that process of iteration. But in terms of what we've talked about so far, it's also giving them that feedback, right? It's like, no, you haven't quite got it. Make this adjustment. And then they'll come back. It's like, okay, you got this part right. This part you still haven't adjusted. This part you went too far in the other direction. So now what you need to do is this. And I think if you do that, you'll probably get more of the product that you want, and they will also feel that they believe that they're giving you what you want. The one other thing I'll say about that, the trick with ambiguity, is we try and get students to love ambiguity. It's one of the hallmarks of intelligence, right? Is that, and I think I have a retired professor here who used to struggle with this all the time. Fantastic teacher, really loved to soak his students in ambiguity, and they hated him for it. When his evaluations came around, of course, 6 months to a year later, he'd get all these letters saying, I didn't know what you were doing at the time, but now I get it, and gosh, thank you so much. I'm doing so much better at my job, professor, because you did this. But he would get these really mediocre teacher ratings because they didn't see it at week 15. And part of what he needed to do, and we had conversations, and he made a little bit of adjustment, but probably not as much as he needed to, is figure out what kind of ambiguity students can deal with and learn from, and what they really hate. And the short rule of thumb on that is they hate any ambiguity that determines how they're going to be graded. So it should always be very, very clear as you can make it exactly what their grade is based on. And then if it's a matter, sort of subject matter of what can be kind of ambiguous, that they're more likely to deal with. You can have them struggle through concepts, struggle through exercises where it's not clear what they're looking for, but not when it comes to the grade. So example from the course I was just showing you that chart from. So I teach a course called Negotiation Skills. And the course is based around all these role-playing exercises where a couple students, it's like you pretend to be a buyer, Chuck pretends to be a seller, you pair up and you're going to do this fictional negotiation. And I don't tell them what I'm looking for in those. I deliberately shove the ambiguity on them, and they kind of have to figure it out. I'm kind of hoping that some of them make mistakes so they have variance that I can then debrief. But that only works because I don't grade them on how well they negotiate. If I graded them on how well they negotiate, they would never put up with that. I grade them on how well they analyze negotiations after it's all said and done. But so the things where I really want them to sort of struggle with ambiguity, at least in this class. I don't know if they work in all classes. I do my best to make sure there's not a grade attached to that. Everything that affects their grade, I try and be as crystal clear as I can. And sometimes, I kind of wish I didn't have to be. I wish I didn't care so much about grades, but they do.
All right, well, I think we're over time, so I really want to thank Dr. Tripp for his time today. Thank
you. Thanks for your time.
I also want to mention the next faculty-led workshop is Thursday, February 16th. Joy Egbert from the College of Ed will be presenting on creating engaging tasks through technology use. So hope to see you all here then. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
That students learn sufficient amount of skills and knowledge, whether they want to or not. You may not agree with that perspective or not. It motivates me to try and think about these things and try to get students to work harder in the classes. So I just kind of want to put that out there before I get into these particular theories. Now, one of the frustrations I hear from many faculty is like, well, students today, they don't want to study, they're here to party, they, whatever sort of excuses, they have no interest in coming to class, et cetera, and we see these behaviors all the time. Faculty, and we're not making this up. This happens, right? But to look at that behavior and then try and come up with an explanation for that behavior and say, well, it's the students. The problem is the students, is an example of what psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, which is that we as humans have the tendency, when we look for explanations, particularly for undesirable behaviors, to say it's the person, it's who that person is, it's their personality, it's their intent, it's their work ethic, it's something internal to them. So we're biased to come up with explanations and sort of that, come up with these internal explanations about them, as opposed to external explanations say, well, it's not necessarily who they are, it's the environment in which they find themselves. Managers do this all the time too. Why are my employees so unproductive? Because they're lazy. And just shout out in a couple, 3 words, what, or a short phrase, what was it that made that class super motivating or super unmotivating to you?
Teacher's passion.
Passion?
The challenge.
Okay, and the challenge was just right, not too much?
Exactly. Yeah, just the right amount.
Topic. I would say topic.
And what was the topic? It was just kind of interesting. It was useful. It was.
For me, if I can see potential, the topic can help me find a good job position. So I'm more interested.
Okay.
Unclear expectations.
Unclear expectations. Ooh, a classic. Anything else?
Fear of failure was motivating.
Okay, so the failure had consequences. I remember my undergrad, and it's been said, amongst people who plan curriculum and so forth, that basically what you plan reflects what you took or suffered as an undergraduate. And I was a Husky, so don't hold that against me. I've been 25 years at WSU, I was 5 years at UW. And I had 2 classes, just real fast. One was super motivating and one was super unmotivating. And the super motivating one, of all things, was the statistics class. And part of what made it to see how awful my grade was. I got a B+, which actually really angered me. And the reason it angered me was I'm looking at this and saying, okay, well, it didn't harm my GPA, but I was averaging 30% on the exams, and it's like, and I felt like I knew almost nothing. I felt like I'd given up, and yet I was doing better than average. How can that be? And so that kind of affected me. Anyway, I want to talk about using a couple different theories to figure out how we can motivate students better in our own courses right now. And as you well know, it can be a challenging task. The students don't study as much as we think that they should. The most recent stats we compiled, at least I think it was just in the Carson College of Business, was they spend about 30 hours per week, full-time students, going to class and studying, and that was it. It used to be worse. I remember one time Chuck and I were in a meeting early on in the days at the Teaching Academy, and we were looking at the NESI data the first time we did NESI, and it came back that the students were studying 11 hours per week outside of class. And Chuck and everyone else, we all kind of looked at each other and we're like, that can't be right. That's way too high. He said, no, that's total, not per course. And we looked at each other, that's way too low. And the student government was in on that meeting, and they all said, no, that's right. Part of the problem that we face, that our students face, is, we're in competition for their attention. They got so many different activities going on. Motivating was that I knew I was going to have to use it as a psych major. The work was challenging, but not too challenging. It was carved up so that every 2 weeks we had to turn in homework, and then the other set of 2 weeks, every 2 weeks we had exams. So it was constantly on top of us. It was very clear that studying paid off in terms of higher grades. were a few things about the class. And then the instructor was obviously very clear and made a difficult concept easier. The most unmotivating class I had as an undergraduate was a physics class, which is kind of surprising because I love physics. And it actually turned me off of the natural sciences and engineering and turned me into psych. And part of the problem with that class was that it was all equations. I didn't understand why all the equations were important. I understand now that eventually I was going to have to know these things. It just didn't seem like a fun place to start. All the stuff that was kind of fun in terms of what the various laws of physics meant and so forth, there was none of that. It was just grinding equation after equation, monotony for 10 weeks. And I gave up. And it's the only class in my undergraduate career where about halfway, 2/3 mark, I just stopped studying completely. Funny thing about that, though, was I remember showing up for the final exam because I'm just kind of obsessive compulsive that way. And as I was showing up to class, sitting there, having no idea what the prof was talking about. And I remember going through the exam, and it was almost kind of freeing. It's like, I have no idea what that is. Oh, I think I might can answer that question. I was the first one to leave the exam. As a glutton for punishment, I actually went back after the grades were posted on many extracurricular, many co-curricular, and many worthwhile co-curricular activities, not all not worthwhile, obviously. And if they're a full-time student, 4 other courses besides the one you're teaching. How do you win that contest for their attention? I think it's a reasonable question to ask, maybe a bit competitive, but it's a reasonable question to ask how it is that you're going to win that particular competition. It won't happen simply if you're super clear at the podium. That's probably a necessary condition, but by no means sufficient. So it's not just that you have to get up there and you do your part and you do your job and they get it or they don't get it, they try or they don't try. I am arguing that wouldn't be a very successful way to motivate students. I personally believe that it's my job as an instructor to motivate my students. But maybe a somewhat controversial statement. I've met other faculty who disagree with that statement. But I don't want to leave it up to them. Part of the reason is that how well a student does and what that student retains at graduation doesn't just affect that student. It affects all the other WSU students. Pardon me for using a little bit of business speak here, but it's our brand. It's our brand image. When employers come and hire, and you got a student who didn't learn much and didn't retain much, and say, "Well, hey, I've met WSU graduates before. Why would I want another?" Right? That's not acceptable to me. And so it is, I think, our business to make sure